Welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at the End of History podcast and jbshreve.com, where we help believers make sense of the chaos of the world we live in through intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that made these times. As we continue in our series of The Empire, a 250-year American story, you probably recognize that the story is actually getting a little closer now to the American Civil War around the middle of the 19th century. We're going to go pretty deep when we get to that part of the story, but there are a few key pieces of the background to that cataclysmic event that we've got to cover before we get there. In today's episodes, we need to look at a couple of major social shifts that took place in the first half of the 19th century. We've already seen how the westward expansion, how Jeffersonian republicanism was shaping the new nation. But if those elements of the American character came from the bottom up of American society, these next two that we're going to look at today, they were just really a total shock to the system, the American system, the American way of life. Today, we're going to look at the Industrial Revolution and the Second Great Awakening in America between 1800 and 1850. That's coming now here at the End of History.
This is the End of History.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So by the year 1800, the United States was still a rural republic of just 5 million people, scattered across farms, frontier cabins, and a handful of modest port towns. Horses and riverboats, they set the pace of life. Most Americans made their living actually from the soil. The idea of getting a paycheck, money in exchange for hours of your life, that didn't really make any sense. An hourly pay, that didn't make sense. It didn't even really fit into the mindset of most Americans. Factories were rare. Cities were small. The idea of the U.S. as an industrial power, at that time, by 1800, it really seemed almost laughable, especially to Europeans. But within 60 years, the nation would surge into the ranks of the world's industrial giants. Its cities would swell, its machines would roar, and its economy would be transformed by steam, by iron, by cotton, and by capital. The American people were caught up in a lot of change, a lot of social upheaval, a literal change to the way of American life that historians would later call the Industrial Revolution. That was what was unfolding here. The 19th century Industrial Revolution, it transformed the world from an economy powered by human and animal labor into one driven by machines, by steam engines, by factories, by mass production. Innovations in transportation, manufacturing, and finance dramatically increased productivity and lowered the cost of goods. While the revolution began in Britain, the United States quickly embraced these technologies, these vast natural resources, this almost natural entrepreneurial spirit for Americans, and it allowed the nation to become one of the world's leading industrial powers by the end of the 19th century. Railroads connected distant markets. Factories, they multiplied across the Northeast, across the Midwest. Millions of immigrants supplied the labor needed to fuel rapid economic expansion. Now, no commodity was more important to this transformation than cotton. The invention of the cotton engine in 1793, it made it profitable to process short staple cotton on a massive scale, causing production across the American South to explode. Raw American cotton really became the lifeblood of British and New England textile mills, where mechanized spinning and weaving machines turned this into expensive cloth. And by the end of the American Civil War, the United States supplied roughly 3/4 of the world's cotton exports, making that crop America's most valuable export commodity. Cotton linked southern plantations, northern factories, and British industry. It linked international shipping, global finance, all into this single economic network. So this immense wealth generated by this trade helped finance railroads, banks, canals, new industries throughout the U.S., and this prosperity rested heavily on the forced labor of enslaved people before the Civil War. Cotton, nevertheless, became the engine that propelled America into the Industrial Revolution and laid the foundation for its emergence as an economic superpower. Now, the opening chapters in this story of this social and cultural transformation, it's not only one of invention and ambition, but also of theft. It's also one of conflict, profound social upheaval like I'm describing here. The Industrial Revolution in America is the story of a young empire learning to build itself, sometimes by its own ingenuity, sometimes by taking what others had already built. In the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of uproar regarding the rise of China in the global economy. This is today, okay? I mean, seriously, this has been a major issue in U.S. elections over the last 20 years. And a key component of that debate, of that controversy, is the idea of intellectual property. Time and again, China has been accused of stealing intellectual property from the U.S. and other leading economies. Over the past 2 decades, Western governments have documented cyber espionage, campaigns targeting aerospace, semiconductor, pharmaceutical, defense companies. Notable cases include the theft of trade secrets from American firms like DuPont, Micron, Motorola, along with allegations involving hacking groups linked to the Chinese state. Stolen designs, proprietary research, they can save years of development in a situation like this. Right? For the Chinese, it can save years of designs and proprietary research and the development and billions in research costs. And that allows Chinese companies to compete more quickly and more cheaply than rivals who invested heavily in creating those innovations, creating those designs. And that seems unfair, right? And honestly, there's little reason to believe that this is not happening. It probably is, probably has been happening, at least for the last 20 years. And we can be confident that that is probably happening because this is the way nations always work, including America. That's what I find interesting about this part of the story here. In the early 19th century, the U.S. cheated and stole intellectual property to facilitate its own rise to power and economic strength. It wasn't tech and communication software at that time, but whereas China is stealing the pieces of intellectual property to secure its space today in the information revolution of our modern era, the U.S. did the same in the 19th century to secure its space in the Industrial Revolution. In the 1780s, 1790s, Britain guarded its industrial technologies with zeal. Really, the zeal of a jealous monarch is what it looked like. Skilled textile workers were forbidden to immigrate. Exporting machinery designs was illegal. The British understood that their spinning frames, their carding machines, their water-powered mills were the engines of what was quickly becoming their global dominance. Well, then comes this guy, Samuel Slater. Slater was this young English textile worker who had apprenticed in the mills of Richard Arkwright, the father of the modern factory system. In 1789, disguised as a simple farm laborer, Slater boarded a ship to America. He didn't carry any blueprints. He just had the detailed workings of Arkwright's machinery stored in his head, stored in his memory. When he arrived in Rhode Island, in the U.S., he partnered with merchant Moses Brown and set about recreating the British system from scratch. By 1793, Slater had built the first successful water-powered spinning mill in the United States. Britain called him Slater the Traitor. America called him the father of the American Industrial Revolution. Slater's mill was the first spark, but it wasn't the last act of industrial espionage that set off the Industrial Revolution in the U.S. Throughout the early 1800s, American entrepreneurs, mechanics, even diplomats, they quietly acquired British machine designs, smuggled out parts, they bribed workers, they reverse engineered imported goods. Francis Cabot Lowell, a Boston merchant, he famously toured British mills in 1811 to 1812, pretending to be a curious gentleman while secretly memorizing the layout of the power looms that he was looking at. When he returned home, he and the machinist, his machinist Paul Moody, they built an improved version of what he had seen, one that would power the great textile city of Lowell, Massachusetts. By the 1820s and 30s, the factory system had taken root in New England. The textile mills of Lowell, Waltham, Pawtucket became symbols of a new industrial order. Female workers in these factories became known as the Lowell Mill Girls. They were young women from New England farms who flocked to the mills for wages, for independence. They lived in company boarding houses. They worked 12 to 14-hour days. They operated the massive power looms that turned cotton from the southern states into cloth from the northern states. The letters and diaries of these Lowell mill girls reveal a world of ambition as well as exhaustion. Some wrote of the thrill of earning their own money. Others described the deafening noise of the looms, the lint-filled air, the relentless pace of factory bells. When wages were cut in the 1830s, the women organized some of the first strikes in American industrial history. Alongside the workers were the inventors, the mechanics who shaped the industrial landscape. Eli Whitney, of course, was famous for the cotton gin. He also pioneered interchangeable parts for firearms and an innovation that would revolutionize manufacturing. Whitney's workshops in Connecticut became training grounds for a generation of machinists who spread the American system, as it came to be called, of precision manufacturing across the nation. There was Oliver Evans, this visionary engineer who dreamed of fully automated flour mills, high-pressure steam engines decades before they became common. Evans was eccentric, brilliant, often frustrated that his ideas were too far ahead of their time. But his designs influenced the steam-powered factories, the locomotives that would soon dominate American life. And if textiles were the first wave of American industrialization, steam and iron were the second. In 1807, Robert Fulton launched the Clermont on the Hudson River. It wasn't the first steamboat, but it was the first commercially successful one. Suddenly, rivers became highways of commerce. Goods that once took weeks to move by flatboat could now travel upstream in days. The Mississippi Valley exploded with trade. Towns like Cincinnati, St. Louis, and New Orleans, they grew into bustling hubs of commerce. Now, steamboats also brought danger. Boilers exploded with terrifying regularity. Newspapers carried stories of ships torn apart mid-river, passengers scalded, passengers drowned. But the Americans embraced the technology with characteristic enthusiasm. Speed mattered more than safety for America during this time. One of my ancestors, a guy by the name of Henry Miller Shreve, he used some of this technology that was being developed at the time to clear the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River had long been used for transporting goods, but steamboats couldn't get on the Mississippi River because submerged trees would sink the big boats. It would just tear a gaping hole in the bottom and they would sink in a matter of minutes. Well, Henry Miller Shreve developed this technology that made clearing the river possible, and that accelerated trade down the mother of all rivers, as it came to be known, or as Abraham Lincoln called it, the father of all rivers. The city of Shreveport ended up being named after Henry Miller Shreve. By the 1830s and 40s, railroads began to knit the nation together. The Baltimore and Ohio, the Mohawk and the Hudson, the Boston and the Worcester. Those lines were among the first. Early locomotives were temperamental beasts, sparking fires, derailing on curves, terrifying livestock. But they transformed the geography of the nation. Railroads shrank distances. They created national markets. They allowed factories to draw raw materials from far away and ship finished goods across the continent. And they also fueled the rise of industrial cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, places that would become giants of steel, coal, and, of course, manufacturing. Industrialization reshaped American society at just about every level. Cities grew at astonishing rates. In 1800, the beginning of the century, only 6% of Americans lived in urban areas. By 1860, that number had tripled. Immigrants from Ireland and Germany poured into the cities, taking jobs in factories and docks and construction. Tenements rose, streets filled with carts and horses and crowds. The airs thickened in these cities with coal smoke. Now keep in mind that the Industrial Revolution wasn't confined to America, not at all. All right, this social transformation or upheaval, if you're living in the midst of it, it was happening everywhere. That's why there were so many changes, so many new approaches and redefinitions of life that were accepted and popularized during that time period. There's a reason why Darwin's Origin of the Species, Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, and a load of other new ideas about life and living became popular during this time period. The state of just being was in flux during the Industrial Revolution. What it meant to be human, what it meant to be alive, what it meant to be a family. Cities became places of opportunity as well as danger, centers of wealth and grinding poverty. They were the laboratories of American modernity. Industrialization also transformed American family life. On farms, families worked together as economic units. In factories, work moved outside the home. Men, women, and children, they often labored separately now. Wage labor replaced household production. Time itself changed. It was regulated not by seasons or, farming season, not by sunlight, now it was measured by factory bells. It was measured by clocks. Some families prospered. Others struggled as wages fluctuated and economic depressions hit. Child labor became common. Reformers decried the exploitation of young workers, but factories depended on these small hands, on nimble fingers. The Industrial Revolution created new freedoms as well as new constraints, and it opened doors for a lot of people, but it closed doors for others as well. We have to understand all of this as the background to the context that gave rise to the American Civil War in the 1860s. They were not separate. No technology shaped America between 1800 and 1860 more profoundly than the cotton gin. Again, invented by Eli Whitney, 1793, this gin made it possible to clean short staple cotton quickly and cheaply. Suddenly, cotton became the most profitable crop in the world. The historian Daniel Walker Howe, in his book, What Hath God Wrought? He described it this way. He says, in response to an apparently insatiable world demand for textiles, U.S. cotton production soared from 73,000 bales in 1800 to 10 times that in 1820, the year that the United States surpassed India as the leading cotton producer. Cotton, fueling an expansion of transatlantic industrial capitalism, enormously enhanced the importance of the United States in the world economy. In 1801, 9% of the world's cotton came from the U.S., and 60% from Asia. Half a century later, the United States provided 68% of a total world production, 3 times as large. The American South was to be the most favored place for the production of raw material of global significance, as the Caribbean sugar islands had been in the 18th century, or as the oil-rich Middle East would become in the 20th century. You get it? The U.S., specifically the cotton plantations of the American South, they were like the Middle East oil states of our present age. This reality right there is what will help us understand the context of the Civil War as much as anything else when we get to that part of this story. So keep that fact in mind. We're also going to look in the next episodes at how this fact completely revamped and redefined the very nature of slavery itself in the South in the first half of the 19th century. That's all coming in later episodes. For now, we just need to understand that by the 1830s, the American South was producing the majority of the world's cotton. Not America's cotton, the world's cotton. Plantations spread across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Cotton exports financed banks. They financed railroads and factories. It enriched northern merchants and southern planters alike. All of this economic growth was tied and interlinked together, but cotton was at the foundation of it all. That's why it would be called King Cotton. Industrialization sharpened the divide between North and South and created a polarized nation, with the industrial states of the North contrasted against the slave-owning states of the South. In the North, they developed factories, railroads, and wage labor. Many Northerners came to see slavery as backwards, as inefficient, as morally wrong, even though Northern industry still profited from the slave-grown cotton in the South. Well, the South doubled down on plantation agriculture. Its leaders argued that slavery was not only necessary, but it was beneficial. It was a positive good, in the words of John C. Calhoun, a famous congressman at that time. As the North industrialized, its society changed. Urban workers, reformers, and religious activists increasingly began to criticize slavery. Abolitionist newspapers circulated. Escaped slaves like Frederick Douglass spoke to packed halls. And the industrial North and the agrarian South, they were really becoming different civilizations during this time period. Industrialization didn't cause this divide, but it did accelerate it. By 1860, the North had 90% of the nation's manufacturing. The South produced 75% of the world's cotton. The North built railroads. The South built cotton gins. The North attracted immigrants. The South relied on enslaved labor. These differences shaped political conflicts over tariffs and banking, internal improvements, and above all, on the expansion of slavery into Western territories, like we've already talked about. And even as all of this industrialization was taking shape in the North, and the South was becoming a slave-based empire of cotton plantations ruled by an elite aristocracy, these same technologies were changing America's westward expansions. Massive movements of the American population shifted westward thanks to trains, steamboats, and advancing technologies. Industrialization fueled expansion. Railroads pushed west. Factories demanded raw materials. Cities demanded food. The ideology of manifest destiny that we've already looked at, America's supposed right to expand across the continent, God-given right to expand across the continent, was intertwined with industrial ambition. And amid all of this turmoil, the U.S. was becoming something new. It was becoming a rising industrial empire. By the 1850s, American factories produced locomotives, firearms, clocks, textiles, machine tools, and all of these were at the level now that they rivaled European goods. The American system of manufacturing, interchangeable parts, precision machinery, mass production, it began to astonish foreign observers, especially by how fast it came to be. At the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition in London, American machines drew crowds. British engineers marveled at the speed and the efficiency of American tools. The young nation that had once stolen British technology was now innovating beyond it. Hey folks, J.B. Shreve here. I hope you're enjoying this podcast episode as well as the wider series. If you're into learning, if you're into faith-based perspectives of history and of current events, I want to invite you to become an Into History Insider at our Patreon page. You can find the links to the Patreon group at theendofhistory.net or by going directly to patreon.com/JB Shreve. A Patreon supporter, for as little as $1 a month, you can access some of our past series all the way from the history of the Middle East, the history of India, how the world works in the School of International Relations, and many, many more podcast series, all of these that have been produced and published since the End of History began in 2012. That's patreon.com/JB Shreve. When you join, be sure to watch your inbox for an email from me where you'll find a link to join our End of History WhatsApp group that includes relevant discussions about today's current events. Again, head to patreon.com/JB Shreve and sign up as a Patreon supporter to the End of History today. Amid all of this shifting dynamics of American society and culture, there's another important thing that occurred alongside the Industrial Revolution. You could say this was another symptom or byproduct of the social upheaval for the people living during these times. Maybe it was. But maybe it was also more than that. Maybe it was actually the hand of God creating a counter or alternative option to the profit-based cotton empire of the South. The Second Great Awakening, it spanned roughly 1795 to 1835. It was one of the most transformative religious movements in American history. Now, don't confuse this one with the First Great Awakening that happened before the Revolutionary War. We looked at that one too. But this one was different. This thing reshaped the nation's spiritual landscape. It democratized American Christianity. It catalyzed a wave of social reform movements that would culminate in abolitionism, temperance, women's activism, and new educational institution. It wasn't a single event, this Second Great Awakening. It was a constellation of revivals, of personalities and regional dynamics that together altered the trajectory of American society. What made this Second Great Awakening so powerful was its timing. The early republic was a nation in flux, politically, economically, culturally, and the American Revolution and the Jeffersonian Revolution had unsettled old hierarchies. Westward expansion created new communities hungry for meaning. Enlightenment rationalism had left many spiritually adrift, and into this moment came a revival movement that emphasized personal choice, emotional experience, and the possibility of immediate salvation. That's a turn away from the predestinarianism of Calvinism that had dominated early American Puritan theology. The historian Daniel Walker Howe, he writes, when one looks for evidence of religious awakening in this period, one finds it everywhere, not only in the astonishing variety of religious sects, but both imported and native, but also in literature, politics, educational institutions, popular culture, social reforms, dietary reforms, utopian experiments, child-rearing practices, and relationships between the sexes. In terms of duration, the Second Great Awakening dwarfed the first because of its diversity. Perhaps it should be called a multitude of contemporaneous awakenings. The awakening began on the frontier, especially around Kentucky and Tennessee, in that area, where Presbyterian minister James McGready, he became one of its earliest catalysts. McGrady's preaching was intense, emotional, morally demanding. He called settlers, often isolated, rough, and spiritually neglected, he called them to repentance. He called them to revival. He called them to renewal. His congregations responded with fervor. By the late 1790s, revival fires were spreading across the region. McGrady's innovation was the camp meeting, a multi-day outdoor revival where thousands gathered to hear preaching, to sing, to pray and experience conversion. These meetings became a hallmark of frontier evangelicalism. They were egalitarian, participatory, emotionally charged, far removed from the formal liturgical worship of older denominations. The most famous camp meeting of all of these occurred in Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801. It was led by Barton W. Stone, a Presbyterian minister whose theology leaned towards Christian primitivism and unity. That's the idea of it. If it's not in the Bible, it's not real, right? Cane Ridge drew an estimated 10 to 20,000 people, an astonishing number when you think about it, for the frontier especially. Attendees reported ecstatic experiences, shouting, falling, jerking, dancing, weeping. It's like a Pentecostal meeting at that time, right? Stone interpreted these manifestations as signs of the Holy Spirit's power. Cane Ridge became a symbol of the awakening's frontier character, democratic, emotional, open to all. It also sparked new denominations, including the Christian Church or Disciples of Christ, which emphasized restoring the simplicity of the New Testament church. Then there's the Methodists. The Methodists became the most successful denomination of the frontier era. They're circuit riders, itinerant preachers who traveled on horseback. They brought the gospel to remote settlements. Because these preachers came from the same social class as their listeners, they built rapport quickly. They spread revivalism across the expanding West. This frontier phase of the awakening, it really democratized American Christianity. It broke down denominational barriers. It elevated lay leadership, and it emphasized personal experience over theological precision. It also shifted American Protestantism towards this idea of postmillennialism, the belief that Christians must reform society to usher in a millennial age of peace before Christ's return. Now, this theology would become the engine of antebellum, or before the war, antebellum reform. It also coded the newly knit together fabric of the young nation. The idea of a national Christian identity became very prominent at this point. The people on the frontier may have been hard living, hard scrabble lives. They may have had one pair of clothes per family and not even that many pair of shoes in the house, but they almost always had a Bible. The ideas of right and wrong, the idea that there was a higher standard to be judged by and to pursue, it was out there, right? And this reality shaped the culture of America in the first half of the 19th century. Men like Abraham Lincoln and others, they came of age in this kind of culture. The Bible greatly shaped the speech and education of many people, if not most Americans on the frontier, as a result of this Second Great Awakening. The historian Mark Knoll, he argues that the Second Great Awakening established a Bible civilization in America, right? Not a Christian America, not a Christian nation, but a Bible civilization in America where Scripture became as omnipresent as the air people breathed. During this era of intense religious revival, Protestant evangelicals successfully democratized that Christianity, right? They replaced traditional state-sponsored church hierarchies with a populist, grassroots reliance on the Bible. Now, that's another big shift here. Prior to this, American Christianity was still shaped largely like it was in Europe. Major denominations headed by highly educated people far, far away. Not so after the Second Great Awakening. This is where you have lay pastors and lay evangelists, people who were qualified not by their education, but by the call of God. They began to spread across the frontier and elsewhere. And this was a major shift in recent Christian history that we can still see the effects of today. One of my favorite things when studying the Civil War era and the era just before it, all around it, is the language they used in their correspondence. It's so ornate, it's just beautiful language. And that's because most Americans were learning to write. They were learning to read through the King James Bible. In Mark Noll's view, this historian's view, this shift profoundly shaped American society by creating a shared moral vocabulary. In a rapidly expanding, highly individualistic republic, the King James Version of the Bible, it served as the primary text for literacy, for law, for social reform, and it provided the moral cohesion necessary to hold a decentralized nation together. And that convinced citizens to voluntarily regulate their own behavior in the name of Christian virtue, Christian love, Christian principles and values. All this democracy and self-learning, it also had a downside though. Because the culture, this Bible culture, lacked a central interpretive authority, individual citizens interpreted Scripture for themselves. Pretty good, right? That's good when you first look at it. But this radical democratization, it ultimately fractured society during the mid-19th century. When the nation faced its greatest crisis, really, the debate over slavery, both abolitionists and pro-slavery defenders, they weaponized the exact same biblical text, leading to a profound theological crisis that mirrors the political break of the Civil War. That's where you get a lot of the denominations out there that are, mainstream Baptists and then Southern Baptists. A lot of it was a disagreement over the issue of slavery. They would look at the same Bible verses and interpret it differently. This also planted the seeds for various sects and cults to spring up over time. They were just seen to be just as legitimate as the other guys, as the other more mainstream Christian groups by this time. While the frontier revivals were exuberant and populist, the second phase of the awakening unfolded in the intellectual centers of New England. So now we're moving away from the frontier towards the urban areas into New England. Timothy Dwight, he was the president of Yale College, the grandson of Jonathan Edwards. He confronted a rising tide of deism and skepticism among students. And through a series of sermons and debates, he sparked a campus revival that spread throughout New England. Dwight emphasized the compatibility of reason and faith, but he also embraced the awakening's emphasis on personal conversion. Then there was Lyman Beecher. This is an incredible story. Lyman Beecher, he was a Congregationalist minister who became one of the most influential figures during this phase of the Second Great Awakening and also during this phase of American history. Beecher supported revivals, but he sought to discipline, to channel these revivals towards moral reform. He preached against intemperance, Sabbath breaking, social disorder. He preached against all those things. As significant as his preaching was, though, his real contribution to the Second Great Awakening and to American history took place in the home with the family that he raised. The Beecher family became a powerhouse of the Second Great Awakening, transforming religious revivalism into an engine for American social reform. This family championed the era's shift toward active piety, as they called it. Lyman believed that the spiritual conversion must manifest in social improvement, in a philosophy that galvanized his 11 children to reshape American culture. The Beechers wielded immense influence across major 19th century reform movements. Lyman co-founded the American Temperance Society, making sobriety a cornerstone of Christian citizenship. His daughters, Catherine and Isabella, they channeled this activist spirit into education and women's rights. Catherine revolutionized American schooling by promoting formalized teacher training for women, while Isabella became a leading voice for women's suffrage. But the family's most profound impact was in the abolitionist movement. Edward Beecher actively resisted pro-slavery violence, while Henry Ward Beecher became one of the nation's most famous anti-slavery preachers, famously funding rifles. They were Beecher Bibles, as they became called, for abolitionist settlers. Most famously, Harriet Beecher Stowe authored Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her emotionally charged gospel-infused narrative personalized the horrors of slavery for millions, demonstrating the ultimate fusion of awakening faith and radical social change. Now, the third and most influential phase of the awakening, this final phase, was shaped by Charles G. Finney. He was a lawyer turned evangelist whose revivals swept through western New York's burned-over district and eventually into major cities. I actually had to learn about this guy in a class on revivalism while I was in Bible school. Finney introduced a series of innovative revival techniques called the New Measures. They were designed to produce immediate conversions. These included what he called the anxious bench, where seekers sat publicly to receive prayer. It included direct confrontational preaching, protracted meetings lasting days or weeks, public prayer by women, emotional appeals, and spontaneous testimonies. Finney believed revivals weren't merely miracles, but they were predictable results of proper methods. This pragmatic approach made revivalism a tool for social transformation. It was kind of a bit of crowd control and behavioral manipulation, if you ask me. I never cared for the excesses of Finney's revivals, but if you grew up in the Bible Belt like I did, you could see a lot of the same characteristics and concepts in many small-town revivals that were pioneered by this guy Charles Finney way back in the Second Great Awakening. The idea of the altar call is nowhere in the Bible that I can think of, but I know of some pastors in churches today that think it's sacrilegious to not include that in their weekly church meetings and revivals. That comes from Charles Finney. Western New York became known as the burned-over district because it was repeatedly swept by revival fires. It also became fertile ground for new religious movements, including Adventism and early Mormonism. Finney's revivals emphasized perfectionism, the belief that Christians could achieve a state of holiness and should therefore work to perfect society. And this idea directly fueled abolitionism, temperance, and women's activism. Now, what's important to recognize here is that the Second Great Awakening was not merely a religious event. It really was a cultural revolution. Its effects rippled through every aspect of American life. The awakening broke the dominance of established churches, and it empowered ordinary people. Camp meetings and revivals welcomed women, welcomed the poor, the uneducated. Lay preaching became common. Denominations like the Methodists and the Baptists, both decentralized and populist, they grew rapidly in this context, in this environment. If you remember from earlier episodes during the Revolutionary War and the pre-revolutionary periods, Baptists were considered crazy fanatics before that point. Well, this movement led to the founding of numerous colleges, seminaries, missionary societies. These institution-trained ministers sent missionaries westward into the Indian territories, into the frontier, into the new settlements, and supported reform movements. The spiritual ferment of the era produced new denominations and movements, including Adventism, dispensationalism. That's a big one to me. The idea of dispensationalism, which so many bad ideas of American Christianity are birthed out of, is actually very, very new in the grand scheme of things for Christian history. I'm not going to go deep on that, but I will probably post an article about it at the website, theendofhistory.net. So be sure and check that out. I'm also going to post a couple of other articles about this, just because I find this period, this concept, this topic of the Second Great Awakening so interesting. But women played a central role in revivals. That was new. They worked as prayer leaders, organizers, moral reformers. This is all new stuff coming into the American scene. The awakening opened new avenues for female activism, especially in temperance and abolitionist societies. This would be the seedbed from which the very serious women's suffrage movement would spring up in later decades. For the purpose of our story, as we draw nearer to the time of the Civil War, the most enduring legacy of the Second Great Awakening was its role in launching America's great antebellum reform movements. This is a theme I've talked about before, but the original social justice warriors were actually Christians. That came into play big time during this era of the Second Great Awakening and the revivals here. The Awakening's theology of free will and moral responsibility, it made slavery intolerable to many evangelicals. Postmillennialism taught that Christians must purify society to prepare for Christ's return. If slavery was a sin, then it had to be eradicated or Jesus was never coming back. Charles Finney himself, he refused communion to slaveholders. He made abolitionism a condition for church membership. His Oberlin College became a center of anti-slavery activism and one of the first American colleges to admit students and women. This was a stop on the Underground Railroad for escaping slaves from the South. The awakening provided both the moral framework and the organizational networks that fueled the abolitionist movement. But it wasn't only abolition. Alcohol abuse was widespread in early America, especially on the frontier, and revivalists saw temperance as essential to moral reform. This was a hard pitch. This was a hard sell at the time. Beecher's sermons against intemperance eventually helped launch the national temperance movement. This movement would collide with the wealth of John D. Rockefeller in the second half of the century. He was a teetotaler, and that was a big part of his religious faith. Before long, a new amendment to the Constitution would actually be enacted that prohibited the sale of alcohol in America. Now think about, of all the things that we ought to have amendments to the Constitution for, or all the things that people have wanted to have amendments for, and yet this is the one that made it. Now, it was eventually overturned, but it sure speaks a lot to the fires and effectiveness of this moral priority that was birthed during the Second Great Awakening. There was also prison and asylum reform. Belief in human perfectibility led reformers to improve prisons, create asylums, and advocate rehabilitation rather than punishment. All of this was new, and all of this was coming in through the Second Great Awakening. And of course, we can't forget the educational reform that the Second Great Awakening fostered. There were missionary societies and revivalist leaders who founded schools across the frontier promoting literacy and moral education. The Second Great Awakening had a uniquely American character. The conditions on the frontier helped it grow. Sparse populations, a lack of established churches, social instability, all of this created a spiritual vacuum that the Second Great Awakening's revivalism filled up. Camp meetings met the need of isolated settlers in ways European churches couldn't do. It was closely tied to democratic ideals. The new republic celebrated individual choice and equality. Well, revivalism mirrored these values by emphasizing free will, personal conversion, and lay participation. It also fit neatly with the expansion and growth of America in the first half of the 19th century. The early 19th century market revolution emphasized self-improvement, personal agency. That's what the Industrial Revolution did in a lot of ways. Well, revivalists drew parallels between economic and spiritual success, reinforcing the appeal of conversion. And Americans rejected the cold rationalism of deism, and they sought emotional, experiential life in their religion. And revivalism provided exactly that. Lastly, the piece of the puzzle that made the Second Great Awakening much more American rather than global or even a European movement, it had to do with the shape and organization of religion in the U.S. Unlike Europe, America had no established national churches after the American Revolution. So that allowed new denominations and revivalist movements to flourish without legal barriers. By 1835, the Second Great Awakening had permanently reshaped American religion and society. You had evangelical Protestantism that became the dominant religious force in the U.S. This is where it happened at. The Methodist and Baptist churches became the largest denominations. Revivalism became a recurring feature of American religious life. I can attest to that just growing up in the Bible Belt, even to this day. Social reform movements, especially abolitionism, drew their moral energy from revivalist theology, and new educational and missionary institutions expanded American Christianity across the continent. The Awakening also set the stage for later religious movements, including the Third Great Awakening and the rise of modern evangelicalism. But it also, very importantly for this point of the story, it set the stage for the Civil War. Now, we're almost to that part of the story. But before we get there, in the next episode, I'm not sure if I'll be able to do this in one single episode or if it will take two, but I want to look at the role of those who were getting left behind and overlooked in all this advancement and growth in America. We're going to look at the others, the ones that history often overlooks during this period. That's coming next in our continuing podcast series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History, where we help believers make sense of the chaos of the world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives on our times and the history that made those times. And we will be back real soon.